and welcome to my series review of the Illuminae Files. So I finished the Illuminae Files series about a week ago now, but I decided to wait to do a series review until after we had read Memento, which was a little short story kind of prequel novella that Amy Kaufman and Jay Kristoff released as a pre-order incentive when you bought Aurora Rising. I didn't have that, but they've recently released it as an audiobook ebook, so I thought I would wait until I'd read that and then I would do a review of all three novels and the novella all at once. I have already shared some of my thoughts in our mid-month wrap-up, so I will link that down in the description. It was supposed to be spoiler-free, and it wasn't until afterwards I was like, oh no, I got a little bit spoilery on it. So I thought today, this review is going to be spoilery, so if you haven't finished the Illuminae Files series and you don't want spoilers, or if you're just somebody who doesn't like spoilers anyway, please feel free to flee. This is your 20-second warning. Because yeah, I'm just going to give you a little bit of information about each of the books, and I'm going to give my thoughts on the series as a whole, and what I would have done differently. Because there are some things in this one that I loved, and some things in this one that just didn't work well for me. I will admit that in my mid-month wrap-up, I said that I'd given Illuminae 5 stars, Gemina 4.5 stars, and Obsidio 4 stars, but I've actually changed this because Memento ended up being a 4.5 stars for me because it was better than Gemina and not as good as Illuminae. So I've dropped Gemina down to a 4 star, and I've dropped Obsidio down to a 3 star. Because the more I thought about them, the more problems I was realising I had with the stories, and it was one of those ones that if I'd left it as a 4, I would have been annoyed at myself, so I just wanted to get that cleared up first. So let's start with Illuminae. This is the first book in the series, and you join this planet called Corenza 4, where there is an illegal mining colony, and Katie is in her schoolroom, and all of a sudden these big ships appear outside the window and their planet is being invaded. So Katie is fleeing from the school. She gets into her truck and has to stop because there's somebody outside her truck who she decides to save, and it's her ex-boyfriend Ezra, who she only broke up with I think about a week ago. And that's a little bit awkward. He's like, are you gonna stop for me? And she's like, oh, I don't really want to, but like, fine, get in. And so Katie and Ezra manage to get to safety, but they end up on different spaceships. So I can't quite remember the specifics of it because there's lots of different spaceships. One of them is on the Hypatia and one of them is on the Alexander, I want to say. But there are a couple of other spaceships that are regularly referenced, which is why I'm finding it hard to remember. But basically they communicate through the email system as they are repairing their relationship and as they're trying to work out what the heck is going on, why their planet has just been attacked, whether their parents have managed to survive, because Ezra's dad was down on the planet and Katie's mum is on a different ship altogether, and she's trying to get across the kind of galaxy to find the place where her dad works, because he works out on a little way station called Heimdall. So you have a lot going on in this book, and I think that is the reason that this one is the 5 stars for me. There is nothing in this book that I can fault. I'm so invested in Katie and Ezra's relationship, the dynamic between them, because of the fact that they're exes and they've just gotten to safety together and they're reconnecting across these emails. The dynamic between them is so fascinating, and it's such a slow burn. Like, you can tell that they both want to get back together, but you know that they've got bigger priorities because they want to know about their friends and their family and their neighbours and who has managed to survive. There's also an AI called Aiden who is introduced in this one, and Katie and Aiden have quite a tense relationship. They become almost friends by the end of it, but there's a point where Aiden is pretending to be Ezra, so he is emailing Katie as though he were Ezra. And she's like, that is a massive imposition. That is so inappropriate. You are totally invading my privacy and my personal space. But because he's an AI, he doesn't see it like that. So seeing his justifications for the things that he gets up to is very fascinating. And there's a whole thing in here when there is a virus called the Phobos virus, which is on one of the spaceships of the people who have survived. And Aiden decides to, like, shove them out into space. I don't know what the actual word for it is, but he's like, yeah, they are more of a risk to the colony because they will infect everybody with this virus and people will die. So in his head, to protect the greater good of the colony, he kills all of these people because they are a risk to the people that he's trying to save. So that's really fascinating, because obviously it's the whole philosophical question, like the trolling problem, of is it bad to kill worse than one person to save 5? What is the worst course of action, like doing nothing or being involved and having that responsibility on your shoulders? The main thing I really, really love about these is the artwork throughout. So you've got lots and lots of spaceship plans. And I mean lots. Like, there are all these different spaceships that are introduced. You've got bits where there's like the words jumping through space outside of the station. So that's fascinating. You've got the words that are in the shapes of the spaceships. You've got all this different stuff going on. And it makes it such a fast read, and it makes it so interesting, because there's so many different ways that this format is used. And I think that is what also manages to make these books less impactful, because so many of the things are introduced in this book and used really well in this book, and then in the following installments it just feels like it's copying the first one. Obviously it's going to, because this is a very unique format and it's a very interesting style, and it stands out from the rest of the YA crowd because of that. I can't think of another YA book that does multimedia quite this intensely. But it does mean that whereas the first one feels very unique, by the time you get to the third one you're like, I've seen all of this before. And it would have been nice if they'd thought of different ways to incorporate new things later on. So in Gemina, they do manage to do this quite well, because in Gemina you are following a girl called Hannah Donnelly who keeps a journal, and these journal illustrations are all by Marie Lu, who wrote the Champion series. So you get different illustrations throughout. Hannah kind of uses the illustrations as her way of coping with moving to this spaceship and coping with everything that's going on, and they are beautiful, and that certainly makes the story pick up speed. You also have a girl called Ella who is interested in hacking, and because of Ella's interest in hacking, there are some little bits, if I can find them, should have done some kind of notations. So there's these bits where you get lots of different code, and then like the image of the thing next to it, because she is the little spider and she's against somebody called Mantis. So you get some back and forth with that, and that's another very interesting aspect. But it means that those are introduced in Gemina and then also reused in Obsidio. So whereas you do get a little bit of the new introduced in the second book, it means that the third one feels even more repetitive and recycled, which is a massive shame. In Gemina, you are following a girl called Hannah. Her father has just moved to this, I think it's the Heimdall Waypoint. It is Heimdall. He's just moved there to be the new captain. She's had to go with him. And while they're there, she has met a guy and fallen in love with him. And she's met a drug dealer and she's getting supplies from him. And her father ends up getting killed because their spaceship also gets invaded, because the people who are invading are called Baytek, and they know that KD's ship from Illuminae is on its way to the Heimdall Waypoint to try and get help. So they're thinking, right, if we go in here and we kill everybody before they get here, and then we can kill them when they get here, and then we've cleaned it up, lots of damage control, everything's fine, no one will know what we've been up to. So their ship gets invaded, and then you've got Hannah and her drug dealer friend Nick kind of teaming up together, trying to work out how to take down these invaders and how to try to survive. This one is quite fast paced in that respect, but it does take about, I think it's about halfway through, not quite halfway through, we're about a quarter of the way through before the invasion begins. So the beginning is quite clunky because it's introducing this plot, but then that takes the rest of the book, and I feel like because it is introduced in quite a clunky way, and because of the fact that it's a very high speed, these people are on our ship and we need to survive, we need to get them killed or get us out as quickly as possible, the fact that it goes on for as long as it does takes away from that tension, because there are bits that don't feel authentic. I mean, obviously, it is fiction and it is a space drama, But I think the way that Hannah is a badass and she kills lots of people very quickly, but then at other points she begins to struggle and it seems a bit contrived because like you've just dealt with people really easily and now you're not dealing with these people even though it's basically the same situation. And I think that it just feels a little bit contrived to me. You then have the third book in the series, which is Obsidio, and on Obsidio you're back on Carenza 4 and you're following Cadie's cousin Asher as she reconnects with her ex-boyfriend Reese, who she now knows is part of this Baytek invading force. Meanwhile, Hannah and Ezra and Cadie and Nick and Ella are all on the same ship. So they all managed to get onto the same ship together. And they decide to travel back to Carenza because they want to see if they can get through. There's like a portable wormhole, a jump station thing. And they want to get through that to try and get back to the core to be like, hey, look what Baytek have done. We're survivors. We've managed to make it back. And they want to see whether there's any survivors on the planet. So despite the fact that the first book is them travelling out to the Heimdall Waypoint, they then travel back to Carenza in this book. And it's pretty much all that happens. There's just not really a lot going on in here. Which is bad because it's over 600 pages. And like there are other aspects, but they are done in such a minimal way that they're very forgettable and they're not very impactful. So towards the end of this book, you have the trial. So all of these files are meant to have been prepared to take Baytek to court and say, like, you are responsible for killing all of these people. Look what you've done, and we are kind of getting our revenge on you for that. But then the court case is... God, it's like maybe... Yeah, it's like 20 pages at the end of the book. You get a little bit at the end of Gemina and you get a little bit at the beginning of Obsidio. But I think the court case altogether has got to be 100 pages at most. And I was kind of more interested in that because you've got all of these files prepared. But I think that actually seeing the cross-examination and the way that the prosecution and the way that the defence were fighting off against one another would have been more interesting. I don't know if that's me coming from a background where I really enjoy crime dramas and I love legal dramas, things like Suits, things like Law and Order, I find those really interesting. So I don't know if that's because of my background that I'm like, maybe get away from the spacey bit and go towards the legal bit, because that's what the whole story is for. Like, all of these files being prepared as evidence, so surely that's where more of the focus should be. I don't know. My light has just died, so if it's suddenly gotten dark, I am sorry. I don't know if we've got any spare lights. Bear with me, I'll phone Sean. Professionalism. And we're back with a proper light. So, where was I? I don't actually remember. This is embarrassing. So basically, I think that that was kind of the whole point of the story, and the fact that that wasn't explored as much was a bit of a shame. I just think it would have been more interesting. There was one thing I did really like about Obsidio, and that was the fact that it shared some little vignettes from different background characters. So there's a guy called Ben Garver, and he is causing no end of trouble because he wants to have more of a say over the control of the ship. But you get to go and see him with his godson and with his best friend's wife, and you also get to see, there's a really touching section where Aiden saves a baby, and that is really impactful. I cannot find it. There you go. So Aiden decides that these people are surplus to requirements and that they are taking up too much of the ship's oxygen and their supplies. So he kills all of these people, but in the process they get this baby and their parents out of there. And so that's a really touching little section. And it makes me think that, like, if throughout the series there'd been more of those little vignettes and they'd made you care about more of the people that were on there, all of these hundreds and thousands of deaths would have been more impactful. Because, I mean, you know for a fact that Kada's mum dies, and that's sad. And they make sure to put the names of people that you will recognise in some of them. So there's one that I'm thinking of in particular, and I know I'm not going to be able to find it, but it's got like all the different names of the people who die. And in there you've got like Mitch Lucker, who is the vocalist for Suicide Silence. So that's a nice little tribute to him because he passed away, 2010, I think. But they mention in the acknowledgements that they have been listening to Suicide Silence as like part of the inspiration, like part of the soundtrack. There you go, Mitch Lucker. So you get names of people that you would recognise on these sheets, like Cami Garcia, that's another author, Veronica Rossi, another author. But because you haven't met these characters in this world, it's more like a little interesting addition of like, oh look, they killed off Veronica Rossi. It's not like we've seen Veronica Rossi with her 3 children struggling to cope with the loss of her husband and she's now gone. And I think if you're going to do little vignettes like that, where you have like literally just 1 or 2 pages dedicated to life on the ship, dedicated to these strangers that you never meet again, dedicated to these people that are just caught up in the crossfire, really. They don't have anything to do with Aiden. They don't have anything to do with the Baytek War. They're just surplus to requirements. And I think if you actually gave them more of that personality, made them a bit more human, it would have a lot more of an impact when Aiden made decisions like that and they decided to kill hundreds of people. But because that only happens a few times, it doesn't have as much of an impact as it could have. And I think even if that had been laced through all 3 books, like every 50 pages you get another 2 pages from someone random in the background, then you would be constantly looking out for their name on things like the casualty lists, on things like the crew lists, and you would be so invested in this world because you'd think like, oh, what about that lady that we met earlier? What about that man that we met the other day? And just by only doing that a couple of times, I think it minimises the impact of it. If they'd done that throughout, because obviously by doing it 1 or 2 times, it makes it seem like it would have been possible for them to do that more. And I think that would have also made these files so much more interesting, because if you're not only coming forward of like, yeah, the 7 of us are the Illuminae group and we are showing our story to you in the attempt to prosecute Baytek. If it wasn't just their story, if it was like, oh, there's thousands of people outside waiting for this verdict because we've told their stories too, it might have had more of an impact. But it was something that I did like. I did like the fact that there was so much death that it was just endless rolling lists of names, because it does show the scope of it and it does put names to these unknown characters. But I think it could have gone that little bit further to make me care even more. But that's just a little niggle. All in all, saying that like I'm nearly finished, I'm not nearly finished. All in all, I do recommend this series. I did enjoy these. I thought that they were entertaining, particularly Illuminae, but I just think that I don't really get the hype all that much. The hype about Memento, I understand. So Memento is a short story set before Illuminae, and it follows a girl called Olivia as she gets a position on Alexander, which is the ship where Aiden originates from. And Olivia has some kind of wiggy feelings about him because he's beginning to talk about himself as an I, and he's asking her lots of inappropriate questions considering he's an AI, and she's like, dude, like, you're an artificial intelligence. I don't want to talk to you about my love life or my father. And it's very interesting psychologically, because you can see that Aiden is becoming self-aware and that he is becoming Aiden, the Aiden that we end up knowing and semi-loving. But the way that Olivia has that impact on him fascinates me. And that story really makes you feel something. So Olivia falls in love with a guy, and it's insta-love, and it's very, very contrived, but also this is a very short story, so of course it's going to be. But she falls in love with him, and Aiden ends up killing him because he thinks that it's for the good of the fleet. So similar to what he does on with the people who have the virus later on in the series. So he kills her boyfriend and then eventually causes her death as well. But these characters make you feel so much so quickly because they're so well written. And that's what I wanted to feel from the rest of the series. Like, I felt really, really interested and invested in Cady and Ezra. But when it came to Hannah and Nick and when it came to Asher and Reese, my interest had just kind of waned. Particularly with Asher and Reese. I think my main problem with Obsidio is that I don't care about them as a couple. And they're where the focus really is. This kind of reminds me, it's going to sound weird. But it kind of reminds me of the Anna and the French Kiss series by Stephanie Perkins. That, like, each book focuses on a different couple, but they're kind of interconnected because you get, like, the cameos in the background. But in space. Because the romance definitely seems to be the focal point. Over the invasion, over the spaceships, over everything. The romances are the focal point, and I wasn't expecting that. I got it from Illuminae, but then I thought, oh, they must get spacier and more sci-fi later on in the series, because everybody says this is an amazing sci-fi series, but they don't really all that much. Asher and Reese have been in a relationship in the past, so Asher gets in trouble with her parents and she gets shipped off to Carenza 4, and Reese obviously ends up working for Baytech. So in this book they're reconnecting and they're kind of obviously on different sides, a bit Romeo and Juliet-esque, because he's part of Baytech and she's part of, like, the rebels who are against them, and they eventually fall in love again. But I just didn't care. I cared about Asher's relationship with Cady. I cared about the fact that Asher was Cady's cousin, and they both think that the other is dead. And if more had been put on that, it would have been more interesting. But there's just so much of her, like, oh, Reese isn't the person that I thought he was. Oh, he is, actually. It feels insta-lovey. And I know we're meant to believe that because they have a past connection, but that past connection isn't actually explored very deeply on the page. A lot of her history isn't explored very deeply. There's some kind of traumatic event that happened that her little sister died, and she blames herself for it. But that's explored very shallowly. And I think if there'd been more focus on her past, if this had been more of Asher's story rather than Asher and Reese's story, and possibly if there'd been a fourth book in the series, if they'd done it so it was like Cady and Ezra, Hannah and Nick, Asher and Reese, all of them, it might have worked better. But I think that Asher and Reese's relationship was so rushed because they wanted to introduce the others and then quickly sum up the legal bit at the end. And that's why this one just falls flat for me. It's also very idealistic. So you've got the fact that there are 7 teenagers. You've got obviously the 3 main couples, and you've also got Ella, who is Nick's sister, who I mentioned earlier as the hacker, and they all survive. This was where I got spoiler in the wrap up, because I didn't really think about it until afterwards that is a spoiler, but it is a spoiler, so I'm sorry. But they all survive, even though they're all teenagers, and I would have felt more if they didn't all survive. Unpopular opinion. I was talking to Sean about it, and I said I wonder if it's because we've been reading adult sci-fi and fantasy recently, and in adult sci-fi and fantasy they often kill off the main characters more. And I said maybe I would have liked this more if it was an adult series. Maybe I'm judging it too harshly because it is YA. But also there are a lot of things in here that aren't very YA. All of the swearing and all of the cursing is blocked out, so you've got, like, beeps throughout. But you can still infer the use of the language. So it's not like it's clean, because if it was clean, that wouldn't be there in the first place. And also it wouldn't be realistic, but you know what I mean. But, I mean, there are bits where people are getting, like, their brains blown out. Descriptions of, like, bullets coming through people and, like, ripping their chest from the inside out. That's not very YA. There's a whole thing in Gemina with this weird parasite thing called the Lanima, which is meant to be used for drugs. It's got, like, a psychotropic kind of thing in its goo, and it gets people high. And they hatch out of, like, cows, and that's weirdly descriptive and really grotesque and gooey. So that doesn't feel very YA. But all of the characters surviving does. And I mean, there are YA authors who have killed off their main characters before. There's a specific series that I'm thinking of, but we're not getting into spoilers for that today. But there are YA authors who have killed off their main characters and have had a massive impact. And it's made it a love it or hate it book, but it's made it really, really impactful. Like, even if it's been divisive, even if people have hated it, it's still elicited a response. And I don't know why people hype this series so much, because, like, these two books do not elicit a response from me. Part of the problem is Gemina, because in Gemina, you have lots of, like, the fake-out deaths. So, Ella gets attacked by one of these Lanimas and you assume that she's dead, and that's really harrowing because she's a disabled character and she is in a very vulnerable place, and the Lanima comes and you're like, oh my god, like, she is completely trapped. And somehow it's never explained how, which I also think is a bit of a cop-out, because that's something that should be explored if you're gonna have a character like Ella. Somehow she manages to escape and she survives, but then it, like, splits, so there's multiple universes, and then Nick dies in Hannah's universe, and Hannah dies in Nick's universe, and then Ella dies in Nick's universe, but then obviously he comes back and she's still alive, and then obviously Hannah has to see Nick die, but then Nick's actually still alive, and all the fake out deaths just mean that it becomes really unimpactful. Like, I would have been sad if Nick had died, don't get me wrong, but then at least I would have felt something. At least I would have had some kind of strong emotional reaction. I would have thought it was horrible, and I would have wished that they hadn't done it, but I would have felt something. It wouldn't have just been like, oh, Nick's dead. Oh, Nick's alive. No, of course. Because it means that every other death just doesn't really mean much, because you're just thinking they're going to come back. And also the fact that most of the people who die are, like, the captains and the people in power. There's probably some deeper, like, meaning to it about, like, overthrowing societal powers and, like, revamping society and things, but I'm not able to think that deeply, so I don't really get that if it is meant to be something like that. But then, like, the same thing happens in Obsidio. You get, what is it, you think Ezra's gonna die? Yeah, their plane, like, comes crashing down and you're like, oh no, Ezra's gonna die, because you know Nick has a parachute, but then Nick somehow manages to save Ezra as well. And I just think, like, just imagine how impactful it would be if you'd met this couple in book 1, and you'd met Cady and Ezra, and you'd seen them as they'd regretted their breakup, and they'd grown back together, and they'd decided to be together, and then they get through the second book, and they're still together, and they're managing to save other people, and they're thinking, like, yeah, we're going to do this, and then it gets to the end of the book, and Nick comes crashing down in his parachute, and he's alone, and he has to go and tell Cady, like, Ezra is dead. And these were his last words, and I'm so sorry that I survived and he didn't. Like, the guilt that Nick would feel, and the impact on Cady, and the way that it would impact the whole Illuminae group. Having that loss, it would motivate them so much more, and it would motivate them so deeply and so strongly. And I think that that was what was missing for me. I would have cried my eyes out if Ezra had died, because he was my favourite character, and I didn't name my son after him. It's just a happy coincidence. But if we'd read these books first, I would happily name my son after Ezra. But I don't get that, because they all survive, and it's all happy-go-lucky, and oh yeah, like, we've lost hundreds of people, but at least we're all together, and it just doesn't work for me. That's my main problem with them. I did like the found family aspect. I thought that was brilliant. There's a couple of conversations in book 3 where Cady's dad says to Ella and says to Hannah, like, I know that you guys have lost your parents, and I'm here. Like, I will be your father now. I will look after you and take you under my wing, and you are part of our family now. That got to me. I thought it was so beautiful, and I loved Isaac Grant, and I wish that he had been focused on more. I'm glad that he got his time to shine in Gemina, because he didn't really get much screen time in Obsidio. But I love the fact they were working with a parent. I love the fact that towards the end it became like the captain was relying on them. It wasn't like, you are teenagers, you're not allowed to do anything. It was, look, you're the best people we have. Like, I don't care about your age, just get on board. That's great, because too many times in YA you've got it that all of the teens are working together and then the adult isn't willing to work with them at all, and then it causes that conflict. And that's interesting when it's explored the first time, but after the, like, 13th time it gets a bit boring. So I loved that aspect. But I do wonder whether I would have liked these more if they had been adult. So part of me is like, as a YA series, am I judging them too harshly? But then the other part of me is like, I'd heard so many amazing things about this series from older readers, not from younger readers. Like, from people who are older than me, from people who read a lot of adult sci-fi and a lot of adult fantasy, who were saying these are an amazing series. And I just don't really get it. Which is such a shame, because I totally get it with the first book. I love the first book so much. And as I said, I do still recommend this series. It's written really well. I can't fault the writing at all. I loved the different formats that were used, the IM conversations, the different, what's it called? They have video transcripts. Those all the way through are really well written, and the way that Amy and Jay switch their writing style so that they can really embody their characters, give them very strong voices, that is brilliant. I just don't think they're as good as people say that they are. And it breaks my heart to say that, because I loved the first one and I thought I was on board for a new favourite series. But unfortunately I wasn't. Yeah. That's all I've really got for you. Should have been more focus on Marilou's illustrations. Should have been more focus on Ella. I loved both of those things, and it feels like, especially in book 3, Ella doesn't get as much screen time as she should. And I think there's this lovely, lovely bit that Marilou illustrates that is like a graphic novel. If they'd done a bit more like this, I think it would have made it stand out in my mind more. But that's just one scene where it's like, oh, the cameras are down, so we're doing it like this. It's like 10 pages at most. But if they'd had the cameras go down for a bit longer, or like, oh, like this camera in this room doesn't work, so here's another artist's rendition, that would have made it more enjoyable for me. You do get a few of the bits with like the interesting art word styles, but then it's exactly the same that you've already seen in the first few books. So what I needed was to like, more like this. Every vent in the ship opens, and it's just lots of vents and doors. That's a unique one for this book, but the ones that are unique compared to the others are few and far between. Also, the fact that the ending is very rushed and that it takes too long to get there. There's also a girl called Katya, and you think that she has been killed, and then you realise that she's survived, so it's another fake-out death. But then my question is, if she has survived, why isn't she part of the Illuminae group? Because they've got like this lovely illustration at the end. Like, Katya could have fitted on there, because she's a really big part of this book, and she means a lot to Asher, and that might have made it a bit better. Also, you've got this cat called Lucky, which is referenced like once, and then is all of a sudden meant to be part of the group, and there's no hint towards like how they get him. Sean was like, maybe if they'd like linked that through earlier, like when they were first leaving Carenza, and I do wonder if I reread it, if there would be like a random cat in the background that I've just missed. But they do seem to have quite a lot of Easter eggs throughout, and I do wonder whether on a reread that would be more impactful, and whether I would enjoy them more, because there would be little things that would twig more on the second time around. But then that was the only reason that I didn't give Memento 5 stars, because in Memento you get chat logs from characters that were minor background characters in book 1, but they aren't introduced in Memento, because they're obviously thinking like, oh well, they can just read the first book and remember who they are. And considering Memento was officially released last year, Illuminae originally came out in 2014, I believe, so that's like 6 years later for anybody who didn't pre-order Aurora Rising, because obviously if you did, then you would have had it a little bit ago. But I just think, like, for the majority of readers, it would have been 6 years since they read that first book if they read it on release, and it feels a bit lazy not introducing those characters more thoroughly, even if it is just a short story. Because they introduce other aspects of it, like they introduce Aiden again properly when they're like one of the most important characters in the series. So surely if Aiden gets a proper introduction, then like the Lieutenant or Stephanie, they should also get a more proper introduction in the novella. I don't know, it sounds like I'm nitpicking now, but it's just a lot of little things that add up to detract from my enjoyment of this series. And yeah, again, I think it's mostly because of how much I like that first book, that's my main problem. I have kind of wondered, like, if I would have liked it more if it had been told the other way around. So if they'd introduced book 1 saying like, oh, there's going to be a court trial and this is what is happening and this is why, and then gone to say like Hannah and Nick to introduce like, oh, well, this is where it began, these people are also involved, and then kind of introduced Katie and Ezra in the middle, because I think my main problem is that Katie and Ezra are the focus of the whole first book, and they're the couple that I care about the most. If they came into the series later, it might have built up a bit more slowly. It wouldn't have been such a fast-paced first book. And then the pacing might have been better for the whole series, and it might have brushed out and evened out some of the problems that I'm having. But then I can't work out how that would actually work, unless they did it so that all three of the couples were in all three of the books, and it unravelled a little slower, and told a little bit of their story each. So like the first third, second third, first third of this one would be the different couples. Because then you'd still have the same amount of pages, but you might get a little bit longer with Asher and Reese to kind of unravel their story a bit more and to make you care about them more. And I just think that that might give me this deeper emotional connection that I'm lacking. That being said, it seems like a really unpopular opinion. Like, most other people seem to think that this series is the bee's knees, that they connect to all of these characters, that they would reread them over and over again. I don't know what I'm missing, really, which is a massive shame because, yeah, as I said, first book, 5 stars. But a solid series overall. I know I've just basically complained about them this whole time, but I think everything that I love about the first one is everything that I love about the next two. And that's where the problem comes in, because I should also have like things to love in the later books, especially considering the first one's under 600 pages. Yeah, the first one is exactly 600 pages, and then these two are over 600 pages. So I think, considering this is the shortest one, maybe if these had been shorter, maybe if this had been longer, like, could have worked out somehow. But yeah, so that was my series review of the Illuminae Files. I hope I'm not forgetting anything that I wanted to say, because I was planning on kind of vaguely preparing this. Then I was like, no, I'm just going to go in and have a chat about them, and that's what we've done. So if you have read this series and you'd like to share your thoughts on it, if there's any aspects that I didn't mention that you really loved or you really hated, leave your comments down below and let's have a discussion about these. And then maybe that will make me realise what I've missed, and if I do a reread in the future, I will be able to look at them through a different lens, and it might make me enjoy them a bit more. But I hope you enjoyed this video. This is our first dedicated series review, so if this is something that you enjoyed and you would like to see more of them in the future, then again, please let us know, because we're trying to prioritise finishing series this year, so this could be something that we do fairly regularly. And we post new videos every Tuesday, Thursday and Saturday, so pop along and see us again in a couple of days. Thank you so much for watching. Bye!